It's April 2020 and spring is here. Time to enjoy a good book with the Paperback Warrior podcast.
Welcome to episode 38 of the Paperback Warrior podcast. I'm Eric, my co-host is Tom, and we love paperback books from the 20th century. We have a blog with daily vintage fiction reviews in the action-adventure, hard-boiled crime, spy, and western genres. You can check out daily reviews at paperbackwarrior.com. We have a vibrant Facebook page where we post links to our reviews and podcast episodes. Search for Paperback Warrior on Facebook. The podcast happens every Monday, and you can subscribe on every podcast platform. If you want to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, I'm told that helps. In fact, Tom, have we had anybody actually review us on Apple?
Well, yes, thank you, Eric. We have. Not as many as I would think, because we get a decent listenership. I don't know how many are listening to Apple. We got one review from someone named Peter Ack, is his sign-on name. Love this, but not while driving. I'm an avid men's adventure book reader and collector. The podcast is for people like me, and I discover so many great reads and facts through these guys. But the only problem is that I often listen while driving and always end up pulling over so I can make notes of books to read. That's a nice review, right?
Yes.
We got one more review. It's called The Lonely Silver Rain. It's a 2-star review. The reviewer is Josh S. Wink.
Josh S. Wink?
11B. That's his sign-on name.
Okay.
He says, if you're going to do a podcast on McGee, don't call the last book The Lonely Silver Lane. You had one job.
Okay.
I know. So we did a podcast on John D. McDonald's Travis McGee. I thought we had a very intelligent, in-depth conversation that fans of the series enjoyed, and people who didn't know a whole lot about the series got to learn something about it. During that episode, I re-listened to it, and I did misspeak. I did refer to the book as The Lonely Silver Lane when the book was The Lonely Silver Rain. But we do a lot of episodes, and I talk a lot, and so I misspoke. But this guy, he went to the trouble of going and writing a review lambasting us for this one misstatement. So I was actually very bummed out when I saw this review. I was sort of like, but then I thought, you know what? This Josh guy is probably just a very unhappy person. You have to be an unhappy person to go to the trouble of like listening to a podcast, then logging into iTunes or creating a log on, finding that episode, writing a review for it. So I think this is a guy who is afflicted with small private parts.
Oh, wow.
And he spends his time, reading Travis McGee books again and again and again when he's not having carnal relations with his own mother.
Oh, boy.
And this leads to him posting bad, out-of-context reviews on Apple Podcasts. So I hope he finds happiness and doesn't die alone and unloved.
Just when we celebrated our milestone of having 2,000 followers on Facebook.
We have one less now, at least. No, I think this guy is probably an unhappy dude, and that's how I'm not carrying the weight of this on my shoulders. I'm basically just saying, okay, I'm going to move on. This is a guy who has issues, and I'm not going to let it bother me. But if you, the listener, want to go on to Apple Podcasts and give us a good review, that might help me feel a little bit better about myself and after the lambasting I got from this guy.
Awesome. Well, I've got an announcement from Paperback Warrior.
Lay it on us.
So, Tom, we are going to collaborate with our good friend Justin Marriott, who runs the Men of Violence magazine. We are going to do a special issue dedicated to post-apocalyptic novels.
Oh, no. All right. Well, good. I mean, it's definitely a subgenre. It's something you know a bit more about than I do, but we did that Jerry Ahern episode where we discussed it at length, and I know this episode we're going to be touching on that as well. And everything Justin Marriott touches turns to gold for me. Anytime one of his fanzines comes out on Amazon, you just have to search for Justin Marriott on Amazon, and you'll see the amazing, amazing content. So
yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun.
All right, cool.
So in terms of shopping, I haven't really done anything. I'm going to go to Chamberlain's this Saturday and do a massive trade-in. I'm going through withdrawals because I haven't bought anything lately. But how about you? Have you bought anything?
Yeah, I got this online friend that I like to discuss books with. His name's John Oak Dalton, and he's an independent filmmaker, and he makes these really cool, low-budget horror films that you should search out. Anyway, John has a pretty great book review blog called BookBeat that I enjoy. It's onthebookbeat.blogspot.com. he covers the same stuff we do, and he's a great resource for foreign crime fiction that gets translated into English and gets released in the U.S. with like no fanfare. So if you want to know more about the Massimo Carlotto, the master of hard-boiled crime in Italy, John's blog's going to set you straight. Anyway, John reached out for me the other week to recommend an American book from 1960 called Drowned Man's Load. Got a copy here I want to hand you, by Robert McCaig. It's a 1962 Permabooks paperback that I bought online. It looks like a Western because there's a picture of a cowboy boot with a spur on it, but it's not really a Western. It's an adventure novel revolving around a mining community in Montana and a conflict between two rival mining companies about whether to dig a mining tunnel under a particular mountain. It's the back of the book recounts a scene where they find a boot floating in a cavern, and they pull the boot out, and they find an actual human foot inside the boot. John compares it to the movie Fargo, which was a movie I loved, and so I ordered it on eBay, and I'm going to try and read and review it on Paperback Warrior. I also bought a book based on, actually not on John's recommendation. I found this one myself, called Lady in Dread by Ryerson Johnson. It's a Fawcett Gold Medal paperback from 1955. I just handed that to you. As an aside, this copy that I just handed you is in like total mint condition. I don't think it's ever been opened or read, and so I feel a little weird popping it open and reading it. I'm hoping I could find maybe an ebook. A friend of the show, James Reasoner, told me that Ryerson Johnson wrote the Doc Savage novels, The Fantastic Island, Land of Always Night, and The Motion Menace. Of course, those books were all written under the Kenneth Roberson house name. He also wrote one of the Mike Shane books under the Brett Halliday pseudonym. Ryerson Johnson's Mike Shane title was Killers from the Keys. I think it's a Florida book. There's a couple books I have under the pseudonym of Matthew Blood, including one called The Avenger, which is unrelated to any of the many series titles, also called The Avenger. Matthew Blood was a pseudonym of a collaboration between this guy Ryerson Johnson and David Dresser, who is the primary author of the Mike Shane books. Reasoner assures me that Ryerson was a good author, and so I picked up this book, Lady in Dread, that you got there in your hands. It's about a girl named Tessie who lives in a mob-controlled, corrupt gambling town called Coalfield. The mob bosses basically own the town and own Tessie. A crusading young lawyer comes to Coalfield with an eye toward blowing the lid off the town and its jungle of rackets. Tessie falls in love with him, and she gets put in danger because the mob is looking for leverage to make this lawyer leave them alone. The book looks great. I'm hoping that maybe Lee Goldberg's Cutting Edge Books or Starkhouse gets the rights and reprints it so I don't have to ruin my pristine copy. So, Eric, what's on the show today?
All right, so I'm going to be doing a feature on a rather unknown author named Jan Stacy, and I'm also going to review the debut entry in the Doomsday Warrior series. It was a 1984 post-apocalyptic series. And, Tom, you're going to do A Night for Screaming by Harry Whittington, one of our favorites.
Yep, so why don't you go ahead with your feature?
All right, so let's get into the feature on Jan Stacy. Listeners who glance at the title of our show might be a little perplexed on the name Jan Stacy, but seasoned 80s post-apocalyptic fans may know the name already. Jan Stacy created and authored the 10-book series of post-apocalyptic novels called The Last Ranger. These ran from 1986 to 1989, but his name wasn't on the cover. Instead, it was the pseudonym of Craig Sargent. Also, listeners may remember a very popular series of 80s post-apocalyptic novels called Doomsday Warrior. I think there were like 19 of those altogether. But guess what? Stacy co-authored the first 4 books of the series with a guy named Ryder Syvertson. This was in 1984 and 1985. The pseudonym used was Ryder Stacy. Get it?
One name from each of them, right?
Right. But we're not done there. So Jan Stacy, under the name John Sievert, co-authored the debut book in another 80s post-apocalyptic series called CADS. That was an acronym for Computerized Attack Defense System. That was once again in 1984. Stacy teamed with Ryder Syvertson for this series. Later installments were written solely by Syvertson, with the last 4 entries penned by an author named David Alexander. Some might remember him from the Phoenix series, among other things that he wrote. Jan Stacy also authored a vigilante novel called Body Smasher in 1989. Some might remember that book had a WWE wrestler on it named Captain Lou Albano.
I've seen those around at used bookstores. They look bizarre.
They really do. Hopefully that provides the listener insight on who Jan Stacy was. Now, I say was because Jan Stacy died in 1989 at the young age of 41. I'm going to do more on that later. But, Tom, I've been digging and investigating the life of Jan Stacy for years. And I'm not the only one. Joe Kinney at Glorious Trash, he's posed some really interesting questions about Stacy's death and the impact it had on The Last Ranger's later installments. Our good friend Justin Marriott did a paperback fanatic article on the Doomsday Warrior series, but there just wasn't that much information to provide on this mysterious Jan Stacy.
Until now?
Until now.
Got it.
Yes. The internet could only produce a New York Times obituary notice that simply said that Jan Stacy died at the age of 41 from AIDS. It also listed his surviving family, which was his mother, stepfather, stepbrother, and stepsister. The obituary also mentioned Stacy's Body Snatcher book and a nonfiction book that he wrote and an art museum that he started. There's no photos, nothing that points to the life and career of Jan Stacy. But I was able to crack this case, Tom. I tracked down Jan Stacy's only known living relative, his stepbrother, Samuel Claiborne. I was able to spend some time on the phone with Claiborne and got the complete scoop on the life of Jan Stacy. Brace yourselves, folks. This one might leave you just a little teary-eyed. So Jan Stacy was born in New York City in 1948. He grew up during the duck and cover time frame of the post-war hysteria between the communist Soviet Union and the U.S. That era reached a fevered pitch during 1962's Cuban Missile Crisis. Stacy was just a kid then. He was a teenager when his father succumbed to alcoholism. His death eventually led to Stacy's dependence on heroin as a teenager. To break the addiction, his mother sent him to Africa to reside with his uncle, who was an ambassador. As a testament to overcoming drug addiction, Stacy would later start a drug rehab program for teens called Encounter. After attending the liberal arts college Sarah Lawrence, which I think Stacy was the first class of males that attended this
right, because
school.
it was a traditionally female college until then. Yeah,
that's right. So Stacy found himself as a mainstay in the beatnik culture surrounding New York City's Washington Square Park. It's here that Stacy began his artistic and politically charged endeavors. According to Claiborne, Stacy began as a folk singer in Washington Square Park. He was palling around with folks like Patti Smith and Robert Mapplethorpe. It was this hippie culture that gave birth to Stacy's artwork, his music, and even these masculine men's action-adventure novels. Stacy's mother was active with the Vietnam War protest. She was in the War Resisters League. There's even a photo somewhere that has Stacy burning his draft card in 1966 in Washington Square. Claiborne doesn't have this photo, but he knows it exists somewhere. In the early 1970s, there was a Xerox artwork movement. Have you ever heard of that, Tom?
Yes, I think that one of the best examples would be like Andy Warhol's work.
Yep.
He did his Campbell Soup Can, which I know that Jan Stacy also flirted with that same style, right?
Yes. So Stacy was really good at this, and Claiborne says that he can remember Stacy removing the labels off of those Campbell Soup cans, and Stacy would make these odd but really cool custom labels for the cans and then sell them on the street. They were immensely popular, so much that Campbell's threatened to sue Stacy.
So funny. Yeah. He was doing like parodies, basically.
He really was. I think that's what it was.
Smart guy.
Yeah. Stacy would launch an art gallery called Fear of Art in Soho. Claiborne told me that it was always assumed that Talking Heads singer and songwriter David Byrne used the Fear of Art gallery as inspiration for the album Fear of Music.
I love that point. I'm a huge David Byrne and Talking Heads fan. Like,
really?
I'm illogically obsessed with them the same way you are with Debbie Harry.
Wow.
And so I edited your article that you wrote about this, and when I read that his Fear of Art inspired the Fear of Music album, that's just remarkable to me. That what a time to be alive in New York.
Yeah, exactly. But here's where things get really interesting for Paperback Warrior fans, folks like you and I that love these books. So Stacy met his lifelong friend and writing partner, Ryder Syvertson, in Washington Square. It was perhaps a chance meeting, or they met through a network of beatnik friends and colleagues. The two immediately hit it off, and they started writing stories, book ideas, and even songs. In the late 70s or early 80s, Stacy asked his stepbrother Claiborne to join his band, and Claiborne can remember the songs that both Syvertson and Stacy had worked on. Both the two friends collaborated together on two nonfiction books, 1983's Great Book of Movie Monsters and 1984's Great Book of Movie Villains. These books were the first two writing endeavors that Ryder and Stacy collaborated on. Now, Stacy also authored a nonfiction book called Rockin' Reels, an illustrated history of rock and roll movies in 1984. Now, Claiborne remembers that St. Martin's Press was involved in some way with these books, and that the publisher paid more for these books than any of Stacy's literary work later. Now, Stacy had a regular, full-time job working at the New York Times in their classified ad department. Stacy wrote the ads, and he kept that job for a long time. It is believed that one of Stacy's pieces of art was on display in their lobby. Claiborne said Stacy loved pulp and movie monsters. He can remember the band practicing on Saturdays, and get this, Tom, hitting a local theater for a weekly marathon of kung fu films. Claiborne says that they would rehearse music, go watch 4 hours of kung fu films, and then go back home and smoke dope.
These were inspired dudes.
It's awesome. So as I alluded to in my intro, Stacy and Syvertson collaborated on the first 4 novels in the Doomsday Warrior series. I'm going to be reviewing the debut Doomsday Warrior novel later, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail now, but the debut Cads novel was written at the same time. It was called Nuke First Strike and was published by Zebra in 1984. But in 1986 is when Stacy's most prominent literary work came about. It was the 10-book Last Ranger series. If you are familiar with the series, you can hit paperbackwarrior.com. Use the desktop version. On the right-hand side, you're going to find a tag for that series. I have all 10 books reviewed there. But the general idea behind the series is that hero Martin Stone is roaming a scorched, devastated America, searching for his sister April. In the series debut, Stone is this cocky, arrogant teenager, and his father is a stout, stern military leader. He's the fighting man, and Stone defies him. But when the Soviet Union nukes America, Stone's father takes the family into this huge underground shelter to live. It's in this big mountainside compound in Colorado. For years, Stone's father teaches him martial arts, weapons training, explosive, survival, and transforms this snot-nosed kid into a fighting guy. His father later dies of a heart attack, and Stone and his family emerge from the compound. But Stone's mother is murdered, and his sister is taken by bandits. So that kicks off this 10-book series of Martin Stone adventures. The series is extremely enjoyable, and some are better than others, but overall I'd probably read them all repeatedly. I really love those books. Here's the interesting part about Stacy's fascination with Doomsday and post-apocalyptic stuff. I thought this was really interesting. So Claiborne told me that the Doomsday thing was really a culmination of things. Stacy growing up in the 1960s during the Cold War scare, his mom was Jewish, and you have to remember that the European Jewish attitude is that God is out to get them. So the idea is that you can't really rely on anything. Nothing's prevalent. So think of like Woody Allen, this paranoid guy who thought the world was out to get him. Stacy was like that, and he loved the movie Dr. Strangelove. That was a 1964 sort of a black comedy film. Stacy and his mom were also at odds and had a strained relationship. She was a committed pacifist, as we alluded to earlier, and he thought that sometimes Stacy would write these macho men's adventure books as a way of defying her. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, he has mom issues, huh?
Yeah, I guess so. So think about the hero Martin Stone, Tom, and you can directly connect him to Stacy. Both men were at odds with their father. Stone was the anti-military guy, so was Stacy. Now, something that's prevalent in the Last Ranger books is Native American mysticism. There's a shaman, there's bows and arrows, there's tribal stuff going on. And get this, so Claiborne said to me that when Stacy went to Africa to break his heroin addiction, he brought back these gorgeous African spears. Claiborne still has one of them. He also brought back a lot of Asian martial arts stuff. Stacy was a great martial artist. He studied Qigong, Baigua, Hasingi, and Tai Chi.
Easy for you to say.
Yeah, I probably butchered all that. Jan moved Chi around instead of just using brute strength. So he was interested in the internal martial arts. He also boxed at the famed Wu-Tang Physical Culture Association. It was this crazy squatter place in the village ran by Frank the Snake Allen. Stacy started training there and was supposedly this really fast, wiry martial artist. This is where Wu-Tang Clan came from.
Okay.
Yeah, so there you go. Stacy was in a lot of musical acts from 78 to 88, and when he was age 29, he asked the younger Claiborne to join his band. The two formed a trio with a guy named Peter Ford called Things Fall Apart. And here's where things really started to fall apart. That band existed from 1983 to 1987, and it really started to find their own sound and audience. The act had began opening on Saturday nights at the famed CBGB Club in New York City. But just as the band had begun making strides, Jan Stacy surprisingly told the members he didn't want to play gigs anymore. Claiborne couldn't understand why. Now I'm going to quote what he told me. He said, "I can remember Jan acting different by 1987. He stopped sharing his drinks or food with me and told me to start rolling my own. That sort of thing. So when he said he didn't want to gig any longer, we sort of became apart for a couple of years. I remember when my daughter was born in May of 1989 and seeing Jan's mother at the hospital. I told her I had ran into Jan a little while back and he looked like death. She got so upset, and I was later told that Jan had tested HIV positive, but I knew right then that he had AIDS. Jan was a bisexual in New York City, and at the time they didn't know how to treat it. So they tried the AZT drug on him, but Jan just couldn't tolerate the drug. In February of 1989, Zebra published the only standalone novel Jan Stacy wrote. This was a vigilante novel called Body Smasher. Claiborne explained the idea behind the novel was to create a whole series of books that had a marketing idea with a wrestling promotion. The book's cover had Captain Lou Albano on it. Stacy met with the wrestler and got to discuss the book's premise with him. Tom, in my reviews of the later installments of The Last Ranger, I stated that they were written in a dark, negative tone, with Martin Stone facing extreme adversity.
It makes a lot more sense now, huh?
It does. In fact, in 1988's The Damned Disciples, there's this really crazy scene where Stone is just forced into this prison where he has to stir this massive pot of drugs called golden nectar, and he's drugged himself. But I think that novel reflects Stacy's endless cycle of AIDS medications. I think his body's resistance to AZT could have been Stone's own resistance to the force of drugs provided by his jailer. Claiborne seems to think that this was a case of life imitating art. In fact, Stacy may have been on his deathbed when he authored the Last Ranger series finale, which was aptly titled, Is This the End? Isn't that crazy?
Interesting.
All right, so I'm going to quote this last part, and then we're going to wrap this feature up. Claiborne remembers Jan Stacy's last days, and again, quote, Jan was still working at the New York Times when he got sick. I'm speculating that he made about $5,000 per book for the adventure novels. As we mentioned earlier, St. Martin's Press paid a little bit more for the nonfiction books. Now, Jan had also received an advance on a memoir he was going to write about getting off of heroin. But Jan did what a lot of people did with AIDS and just stayed distant. He didn't want to hang out. He didn't want to talk about AIDS. He didn't want to do anything. But I remember calling writer Syvertson maybe in July or August of '89, and he told me if I wanted to see Jan to go to the Cabrini Medical Center in New York City because he was in a coma. One of Jan's martial arts teachers, Mr. Chin, which there's actually a Chin character in the Doomsday Warrior novel.
Interesting.
Yeah. Was this unbelievable World War II veteran, and he gave Jan some chi and was able to wake him up from the coma. Jan left the hospital and wanted to go to Cape Cod, Massachusetts to live with his mother and his stepfather. I drove him up in a Dodge Astro van, and I remember he was so small at the time, he had difficulty getting up the steps. We got to the house, and Jan was really reserved. He motioned for me to come over and told me he loved me. That was a rare thing, and he told me he didn't want to die. His health got really bad at the house, and his stepfather and mother put him back in the hospital, where he eventually succumbed to his illness. Tom, what a short but eventful life that Jan Stacy led. He really had an incredible life. It's a shame that his life ended so quickly. I can only imagine how many fantastic novels and book ideas that he had left to write. But all we have left are 16 awesome men's action-adventure novels and these 3 nonfiction titles. Now, I'll have a complete write-up on Jan Stacy on paperbackwarrior.com. I'll even have the first photos of Jan Stacy to hit the internet, at least that I'm aware of. Like most people, I've never seen a photo of Jan Stacy, but Claiborne has sent me a handful of photos that I'm going to present with this article. Many thanks to Samuel Claiborne for going down memory lane. I know it was really hard for him to talk about his brother's death, but myself and so many of Stacy's fans and readers really appreciate the sacrifice. Thanks, Samuel, for the time you spent with me. Tom, I got a little teary-eyed on that. So
no, it's just so nice that we're able to remember these guys who didn't make a ton of money. They're still being read today. They have passionate fans. I still see those CADS books and the Doomsday Warrior books everywhere, and so it's nice that we can do that. And so you did a great job with that, man. I really appreciate it, and I know he would too if you were around.
Awesome. Well, let's jump into A Night for Screaming
by Harry Whittington. Screaming by Harry Whittington. I'll make this relatively quick. It's a great book. Harry Whittington was a Florida native who wrote about 170 books between 1946 and 1988. People call him the king of paperbacks during that important era of American literature. He's one of my favorite guys. But when you write 170 books, some are going to be good, some are going to be bad. A Night for Screaming from 1960 is a good one. It's a fugitive on the run story told by Mitch Walker, an innocent man accused of murder who's dodging the law. He finds himself broke and hungry in a small Kansas town after being booted from a freight train the night before. There's a police detective from back home who's hunting for him named Fred Palmer, who's been pursuing Mitch. Palmer's this fantastic character. He's a brilliant and brutal cop who can quarterback the pursuit, arrest, and a torturous interrogation and conviction of any fugitive. And so when Detective Palmer arrives in Kansas to join the hunt, it's like Mitch's worst nightmare. He takes refuge as a migrant worker on a mega farm. The less that you know about what's going on in this farm, the better. This is a heck of a story, and I'm not going to ruin any of it for you here. A Night for Screaming by Harry Whittington is one that's going to keep you turning the pages long after you should be attending to other needs. Whittington wrote very compelling books. This is among his best. Today's authors could learn a lot from Whittington's knack for plotting just a tightly wound, fat-free story. Stark House has repackaged the book in a double, along with Any Woman He Wanted, another Harry Whittington book, and a pretty informative introduction by David Wilson. So the book, again, is A Night for Screaming by Harry Whittington. I got a review at paperbackwarrior.com, but go out and get this book. It's just remarkably good.
Tom, do you have a favorite Harry Whittington title?
Yes, my favorite Harry Whittington book is A Ticket to Hell. It was, I think, originally a Fawcett Gold Medal book. It was also reprinted by Black Lizard. It's just an amazing book. Unfortunately, I read it before I met you and started writing for Paperback Warrior, so I don't have a review available online, but it is my favorite Harry Whittington book, one of my favorite books of all time. It's just an amazingly...
Oh, wow.
In fact, it was so good I gave it to my mom, and she read it and loved it.
Wow, okay, so I need to read that.
A Ticket to Hell. Yeah, read it and review it, because our readers deserve and listeners deserve to hear your take on it.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to finish up real quick here with my review of Doomsday Warrior #1, which is just called Doomsday Warrior. Again, this was a series published by Zebra. It ran for a total of 19 installments between 1984 through 1991. The first 4 novels, Doomsday Warrior, Red America, The Last American, and Bloody America, were authored by both Jan Stacy and Ryder Syvertson under the pseudonym of Ryder Stacy. The remainder of the series was penned solely by Syvertson. My review is going to be just for the first novel. The first installment is set in the year of 2089, where most of the world is either controlled by the Soviet Union or in a widely contested battle with a communist country. Most of the U.S. has been decimated by nuclear bombs, and the survivors maintain this meager living either as slaves or wretched scavengers that have succumbed to radiation side effects. With the nuclear attack occurring in 1984, the book's characters are all second to third generation survivors. I thought that was a unique approach that mirrors another popular Doomsday series in Deathlands. The series stars a guy named Ted Roxon, an action-oriented adventurer that leads an American resistance group called the American Free Cities. While most of the U.S. is controlled and enslaved by the Soviet Union, underground cities still remain that are free and liberated from communist control. Now, Roxon resides in a place called Century City. It's this really expansive free society that exists under a section of Colorado's Rocky Mountains. Now, that's similar to Jan Stacy's character Martin Stone in The Last Ranger. Get it? Martin Stone, Ted Roxon. This guy's got a fascination with the Rocky Mountains and rocks, apparently. Roxon's role was to lead reconnaissance patrols on missions to discover new supplies, weapons, and enemy patrols. It's during one of these missions that readers are first introduced to Roxon and his firefighter team. After blowing up a large bridge and a number of Soviet personnel carriers, Roxon's team comes under heavy fire from communist forces. After numerous casualties, the team retreats back to Century City to formulate a new plan of attack. The intense battle is reported back to 3 Soviet leaders. It's a trio who compete for political power, and they begin this new patrol to find more resistance fighters. After locating a few underground cities, the Soviets are able to capture a number of American prisoners, and they use this advanced technology called a mind breaker to pull pertinent information from American prisoners. So soon the captives begin revealing locations of more underground cities that the Soviets hope to nuke. Now, the first 189 pages of this book is clearly a debut novel that focuses on Roxon's attempts to break into a Soviet stronghold in Denver. His mission is to retrieve the captives, destroy the mindbreaker, and prevent the Soviets from gaining the location of Century City. It's a really riveting, explosive narrative, and it rivals and exceeds even some of the best 1980s post-apocalyptic novels I've read. While that was enjoyable, the logic behind the book's second half is puzzling to me. It's immediately clear that a new book begins at page 189. So at 337 total pages, one would think Zebra would have capitalized on this and released the book's second half as a second installment. These books are retailing for $2.95 each, so essentially Zebra would have been doubling their money from Abbott consumers. Regardless of the publisher's marketing strategy, Doomsday Warrior's second narrative explores Roxon's attempts to locate a technologically advanced race in America's Pacific Northwest region. The narrative begins with an expeditionary unit returning to Century City to report this strange mutant male they found near the Pacific coastline. This area remains vastly unexplored, and the team is really surprised to find people, evolved animals, and a swath of jungle and wilderness that remains nearly intact despite the Soviet Union's devastating nuclear attack. Roxon, hoping to journey even further than the former team, recruits 3 men to assist him in exploring this new untapped resource. And that's the narrative of the second half of the book. As you can see, it's a totally different story. It was plainly written as a second novel, but I don't know why Zebra did what they did. Tom, do you remember a movie that came out a couple of years ago called Annihilation with Natalie Portman?
Yeah, it's based on a contemporary book. Yeah. I have it.
So they must have read this book because there's clearly this team of military personnel that are going into this untapped region in the Pacific Northwest that's got like a force field around it of like fog and smog and all this weird stuff. And there's all these evolved animals there, and it's all grown up and it's abandoned. It's almost the exact same thing as what I saw in that movie. I'm not sure about the book. But
the original author's estate should call their attorneys.
Yes, we ripped off Doomsday Warrior.
Yeah, you could be an expert witness at the trial.
Yeah. Anyway, that's all I have on Doomsday Warrior by Jan Stacy.
All right. So anyway, that wraps up this episode of Paperback Warrior Podcast. Thank you for listening. Find our reviews every day at paperbackwarrior.com, and we will see you next Monday on the podcast. Drive gently.
Thanks for listening.